this discussion on criticism with your history paper as well, something that you did in your earlier semesters, right? Yeah, so can somebody quickly tell me what are the things that we have discussed so that we continue? Does one remember? Don't remember. क्या हुआ? पोइट्री का क्लास काफी ट्रॉमेटिक रहा क्या आपके लिए? अब चुपचाप बैठे हो, क्या हुआ?
Actually, yes, we studied the poem Daddy by Sylvia Plath.
Which one, Daddy?
Yes.
So you have not recovered from Nazism, it seems.
Maybe.
Sir, I
Yes.
think
Nazis.
Yeah. And can you relate what Sylvia Plath does with what T.S. Eliot has said about impersonality, about tradition and individual talent?
Sir, actually, no. I mean, I personally could not, but I can see the American ideals of individualism and, well, her poetry I found more towards a romantic side, like romantic tendencies.
Okay. What are other responses? How many of you agree with Jaladi's observation?
Sir, I wanted to ask something that wouldn't that be considered like opposite what Eliot said about impersonality and individuality should not be seen in your work, and whereas Sylvia Plath, she very much wrote personalized poetry. We could look at her life in her poems. So aren't
So you can see it's opposite of what Eliot is saying. I think this is something, and Jaldi could not find any relation between the two, while Saloni found an important relation. And that relation is that of negation or opposition. So pardon?
I would not say I don't find any relation, but I do not definitely find the main ideas of impersonalization coinciding.
And Saloni found that they are opposite to what Eliot is saying. Yeah. So how will you reconcile Eliot's statement and Sylvia Plath's poetry?
So we discussed that romantic ideals were a little tougher to shake off in the case of poetry. So maybe there is still a tendency towards romantic ideals in America and elsewhere.
So do you think Sylvia Plath is romantic?
Yes, all the features of romanticism like subjectivity, expression of emotions, all of that is yes, those features are there in her poetry. So if I had to, I would classify her as romantic. I may be wrong, of course.
So here is the thing. T.S. Eliot and his generation of poets like Wallace Stevens, William Carlos Williams, uh, uh, Ezra Pound, H.D., Hilda Doolittle, the entire generation, uh, Marianne Moore, all these modernist poets, yeah, who emphasize impersonality, myth, and illusion, right, fragmentation as their devices, became established, and there was a reaction against them in form of what is known as confessional poetry. And Robert Lowell, if you have heard of his name, did you hear of Robert Lowell?
Yes, sir, just in the previous class.
Right. So Robert Lowell and confessional school reacted against Eliotian dictum of impersonality, myth, because they found it too esoteric, hermetic, and they went back to poetry as a form of bhadas nikalna, right? Spontaneous overflow, but as a form of वो जो भड़ास निकालते हैं ना वैसे. So, and that also connected with something called beats and the counterculture in America. And you have people like Allen Ginsberg, Kerouac, others who wrote confessional beat poetry. They talked about Theodore Roethke, talked about very often their own lives, uh, their own mental disorders, illnesses, depressions, sexual encounters, homosexuality, drugs, casual sex, and a kind of anger against the establishment, right? And this is the school to which Sylvia Plath belongs. And you might have heard of Charles Bukowski, another very important Beats poet, right? So all this developed as a reaction against established modernism, right? So modernism which got established. So this in some sense is a form of postmodernism, right? Emphasis comes back to your subjectivity, but there is a difference in Sylvia Plath's subjectivity and Wordsworth's subjectivity, right? Yes, no?
Yes, sir. Often her poems are like too much information. That's how I personally term it. Like we used to differentiate.
So even if she's talking about herself and more subjective, instead of objective correlatives, subjective correlatives is what the confessional poets talk about. They don't. They are not romantics in the sense of they don't romanticize nature or life. They don't find redeeming features in nature, right? Uh, and it becomes a kind of autobiographical poetry very often. And most of the autobiography is full of the sordid, uh, dirty linings in their personal life, which they want to dry on uh, the reader's head very often. So, they, and it was also a kind of opposition to certain academic school of poetry, which T.S. Eliot seems to be appealing to, right? And this academicism comes in through academic establishment of modernism. And one of the most important person who established modernism was a person called F.R. Lewis, right? And F.R. Lewis, along with the other Cambridge scholars like I. Richards and Empson, right, in some way elevated or canonized modernist poetry, right? And this counter to this establishment, you find this confessional and beat poetry in America. So does that make sense? How to situate Sylvia Plath in the historical context?
Yes, sir, that was in fact helpful because while we were doing the poem, I was wondering if, like, I was trying to relate it to what we had discussed, and it's like, ye to kaha, but yeah, I got it.
Yes, so negation is also a relation. So
Yes,
the establishment of, she negates Eliotianism or Eliot's dogma, principle which had become a dogma,
yes, in
right?
fact, as far as I understand, in Eliot's poems, there is a lot of impersonality, as he himself promotes, and in stark opposite, there is Platt's poems, which are too personal, so to say.
Yeah, she talks about her own bouts of depression and miscarriages and
Yes,
maybe sexual hookups, and the anger against her father becomes symbolic. Her anger against the establishment that you find in Daddy, right?
yes. So this could be like, I'm not saying this is the same, but it could be related to the neoclassical ideas, and then the opposition to neoclassical ideas and romanticism came forward, and we see this difference even there.
And when romanticism became established, Eliot's school
Yes,
is a reaction against that romanticism, Victorian romanticism,
yes,
and real
yes,
and confessional poetry, and Beats is a reaction against establishment of Eliot schools. So there is a function of negation that is at work
yes.
in West literary history.
Although one thing I noticed, now that you probed us to think, is that we discussed that she moves from I to you in the course of the poem, and hence employing this idea of, and with all the imagery that she produces throughout the poem, she, in a way, through the images, through the imagery, she makes it sort of universal, because the World War was like a major event, like it was a major event, and it impacted a lot of people. So with the barbed wires and all of these, and the imageries of the concentration camp, she
Hmm.
might put into use this T.S. Eliot's objective correlative method in a way, although I'm not
Yeah, when
sure.
Daddy becomes a kind of symbol for Nazi or for her, she calls him for her, right? Uh,
Yes, so
and
yes, so
so
not
when you see Daddy as Hitler, then you also see Hitler as Daddy. That's it.
that's okay.
So, yes. So it goes beyond personal, right? And probably this is the place where personal as political becomes a slogan for feminism as well, uh, in the 60s. Right? So personal is political is the feminist statement that you can find in Sylvia Plath. Yes. So these are the connections that you are supposed to make, and very often keys to understanding lie in histories, right? That is what we have been discussing right throughout the last semester. Uh, so key to Sylvia Plath lies in how the whole movement is a kind of negation of modernism, with its emphasis on complexity, myth, fragmentation, impersonality, so on and so forth. Okay, so F.R. Lewis, I think, is one of the most important critic till 1960s, because he in some way helps to consolidate English literary canon, right? Especially writers like Joseph Conrad becomes a kind of important addition to the whole English canon, and English literary canon in novel especially is one of the important contributions of F.R. Lewis. And you can again see the pedagogical context at work over here. So the kind of novels that you study in India from English literature, very often the whole canon comes from people like Leavies, right? And so after 1960s, there is a kind of reaction against Leavies' idea of literary canon and culture, and his justification of humanity is something which can be called liberal humanist kind of position that he takes instead of Marxist or kind of radical political theory. He seems to be a kind of liberal humanist, and he ran a journal called Scrutiny, which he edited with a person called Q.D. Leavies, his wife. And that Scrutiny became one of the most influential journals of the time, which promoted a particular kind of modern understanding of literature, which was modernist. He emphasized the cultural significance of literature as justification for teaching literature, right? Something like Matthew Arnold. So names of his books are books like The Great Traditions, and that consolidates canon of Jane Austen and George Eliot and others in the whole syllabus of England, right? Which in England, we are talking of England here, right? And F.R. Lewis refused to theorize very often. And that becomes one of the cornerstones of his way of approaching literature. When a very famous comparative research scholar named René Welleck asked him to state his theoretical principles, he refused to do it. He says that literary criticism has a specific business. It is not philosophy, it is not theory. It is not larger theory, nor is literary criticism concerned with larger theories in poem. Like, say, for example, while reading William Blake's poem, the emphasis is not so much on William Blake's philosophical system, but a close, careful, sensitive reading of individual poems by Blake and what that text tells us. And he emphasizes what he calls the complete response to the poem. So his emphasis is on a distinctive mode of reading, one which does not go into larger philosophical, metaphysical questions or larger definitions, theoretical definitions, but tends to focus on the text itself. So this is what connects F.R. Lewis with I. Richards, right? Their emphasis is on close reading and unpacking of significance of words on the page, rather than going into the large historical context or personal biography of Blake or his philosophical school or his religious belief. They are more interested in what poems tell us rather than what all this extra, what should I say, extra outside the text, extrinsic factors influencing your reading. So instead of approaching Wordsworth, keeping in mind all his theories of poetry and his historical context and biography, instead of doing that, when you focus only on the words on the page, focusing on something called intrinsic meaning of the text, that is very close to I. Richards' approach as well. So the name of his journal is Scrutiny, which gives you a clue to how what kind of method he promoted in reading. So I. Richard Empson and F.R. Lewis, along with T.S. Eliot, These are the four names which have deeply influenced new criticism. Right? Any questions? So what F.R. Lewis is doing, he is arguing for distinctiveness of literary criticism as a discipline in itself. Literary criticism is not a branch of philosophy, according to names. Kiske names? Yeah, Eliot, I. Richards, William Emerson and F.R. Leavies. ये चार नाम न्यू क्रिटिसिज्म के प्रिकर्सर्स माने जाते हैं, right? And what is common to both is both these four people as well as new criticism hold that words on the page, close analysis, sensitive, intelligent analysis of words on the page is primary task of criticism. Right? And historical, larger philosophical, theoretical queries are not as important. That is one important idea in that you find in new critics as well as in these four British names. Eliot is not strictly British because he is American who has gone over to England and settled. But these three names from Cambridge actually are making an attempt to establish literary criticism as an autonomous discipline, not as a branch of philosophy or sociology or psychology. They want to establish it as a kind of autonomous discipline, literary criticism, whose primary task is to make sense of literary text around you. That is their primary task, right? So that connects these Cambridge scholars with American School of New Criticism, right? And even Eliot talked about reading poem as a poem and not as something else, not as a statement of political philosophy or expression of your theological views or your psychological problems, but poem should be read as a poem. So these are some of the basics of Cambridge School and T.S. Eliot. So if these are clear for you, we'll go over to new criticism, or you want to ask something about these scholars.
Sir,
yeah.
You said something about Cambridge School. So is like these three consist of Cambridge School. Is that what?
Because these three were associated with Cambridge, right? And also shared certain ideas. So there were a lot of differences, even in generation. Means I. Richards must be the oldest, and his student was William Empson, and later on you had F.R. Leavies. So almost like three generations of scholars and critics in Cambridge with similar views, though there are a lot of differences. For example, I. Richards would draw upon linguistics, semantics, and psychology. Empson would not draw upon all these things, while F.R. Lewis would state that you should avoid all these questions and only stick to the words on the page or to the poem itself, poem as a poem, not so certain way of stating how you should read. So, and that connects also to T.S. Eliot, who talks about function of criticism as explication of work of art and elucidation of work of art and correction of taste. That becomes a kind of paradigm which is continuous from Matthew Arnold to F.R. Lewis. All of these people are concerned with kind of creating an elitist canon of English literature, right? And the whole politics of that is that they are trying, one section of the new middle class is trying to establish its hegemony, or the hegemonic definition of culture over other working class or the popular literature of times, right? So, and for that they are drawing upon the ideas of art as they found it among aristocrats. So this is the Arnoldian paradigm of culture studies, and so that's why after 1960s, with the people like Raymond Williams and Richard Hoggart, these people questioned this elitist bourgeois, dead white males mostly canon through a Marxist lens, right? And they argued how these models of culture and literature are actually exclusionary. They exclude working class cultures and exclude popular, something that they want to rectify, thus giving birth to a kind of revised notion of culture that sees culture as a kind of not completely autonomous, but having political economic dimensions as well, which laid foundation stone to what is known as cultural studies. And Raymond Williams' influence in British canon can be found in what is known as Birmingham School of Culture Studies, right? So modern culture studies emerged by criticizing Arnold Leavies' paradigm of culture, right? For Arnold as well as Leavies, literature and culture is a kind of repository of higher values, replacing religion, right? Aesthetic and higher aesthetic and ethical values that replace, that are meant to replace religion. So this kind of notion of culture is challenged, right? So when we talk of Indian culture, what model do we follow? Do we follow cultural studies model of culture, or do we follow Arnold and Leavies' model of culture? Mansi, you had a question?
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
So you said in the morning class, I think you said it for F.R. Lewis, that he wanted to develop a scientific and objective method for analysis and interpretation. And he wasn't very appreciative of the subjective analysis of the text.
Not F.R. Lewis, I.A. Richards.
Okay, but then I think in Emerson, I think his book Seven Types of Ambiguity, where then there was a same poem can mean multiple things. So they do differ here from each other, right?
No, I.A. Richards is not saying that poems may not have multiple interpretations, right? What he is saying that they cannot have arbitrary interpretations. Just said, daddy ka interpretation cannot be that it is about a tree, no, or it is about your daddy, right? So there cannot be arbitrary, and that's what I. Richards, and it has to be grounded on certain understanding of poetic use of language, right? So though, as you say, there is difference, and as I said, in all these three critics there is a difference, but the commonality is emphasis on distinctiveness of literary language, literature as an embodiment of higher values, right? And activity of criticism as close, systematic unpacking of words on page. These three things connect these three people together. So in spite of great divergences, these are the grounds which are common to them. right? Right. Okay. Any other question? Okay, culture studies is something that you will study in your postgraduate program, right? As a part of official syllabus. So we are not going there. We are going to new criticism now. Uh, One, because it's connected to all these ideas. Secondly, we are looking at a period before 1960s, right? As a kind of cutoff point for ourselves for BA program. Yeah, yes, Jan. Intrinsic is the word I have used to explain what he is saying, intrinsic, extrinsic. He doesn't use these terms. He focuses on what he calls the full response to words on page or text. Sensitive, feeling through, thinking through those words which are there in front of you. Right, Jan? Right. Any other question? Okay. So what is this business called new criticism? Right? New criticism is a label. Yeah. Jaldi, you have a question?
I raised, yes,
Yeah.
I raised my hand.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
anyway.
Yeah.
So my question is not as usual related to what main discussion are we doing, but there is a tangent nevertheless. So currently, what trend in literature can be said to be going on? Like, uh, we're discussing all these literary trends, but what is going on right now?
See, uh, first you have to make a distinction between literary trend and critical trends. Yeah. So are you talking
Yes.
about trends in novels, poetry, drama, fiction, or are you talking about criticism and theory ke trends?
So actually both, because see, there is an influence of both on each other. So I mean, that has been established over our discussions and even from the reading. But
Yeah.
yeah, I would like, if we had to focus on one, I would say the literary trend, and then the critical trend can be discussed later about on.
So what
Mhm.
happens is after 1960s, right? Especially after 1967 or mid 1960s, there is a questioning of all fundamentals of modernity, and modernism also is a canonical school now, right? Like Eliot School. Eliot got Nobel Prize in I think 1958 or what 19. I don't remember exactly. So uh, Eliot getting Nobel Prize and he being kind of legitimacy on modernism, right? There is a reaction against that in literature. One reaction is development of this confessional and beats in poetry, right? And beats also in fiction and so on. And a kind of label that is used is postmodernism. And that is a very, what should I say, ambiguous, complicated label. But it's a, in some sense, suggests that there is a reaction against whatever has happened till 1960. And after 1960, there is a reaction against new criticism as well, and the whole Arnoldian paradigm of culture, right? So there is a this reaction, and it goes on largely up to 1980 and 90. So this is the period of theory where you have things like postmodernism, post-structuralism, structuralism, and newer versions of feminism, psychoanalysis, kinds of Marxism, and so on and so forth, right, up to 80s. And this is the period also of great social movements of various kinds from 60 to 90. And then with the collapse of the Soviet Union, Cold War also seems to dissipate. And after the collapse of Soviet Union, many large-scale social movements also started losing their steam. So literary criticism after 1990 is a kind of, on one hand, you continue this post-structuralism, feminism, Marxism kind of things, psychoanalysis, in सबका mixture, post-colonialism. You continue that in some sense, right? But the new emergent ideas are no longer the kind of politically loaded or the approaches, but more scientific approaches, something called consilience. Means consilience was the term used by somebody called Wilson to show that humanities and natural sciences can still be interdisciplinary. Right. So there is something like cognitive linguistics, cognitive poetics, cognitive literary studies. Right. There is also something like post-humanism and transhumanism. There is also something like literary Darwinism, where the ideas of evolutionary neurobiology are used in interpretation of text, and so on, eco-criticism, and so on and so forth. So that's what you have today. Instead of having a kind of single trend, it in some sense continuation of Cold War political readings of literature is still continued. But that does not have its relation in social movements any longer. And you have cognitive literary studies as a very prominent development. And post-humanism, right? Animal studies, disability studies, trauma studies. These are some of the newer trends that you find that in literary criticism.
So is it right to say that as the time passed, literary trends and criticism as well became more and more complicated or
Yes,
diverse?
yes, diverse is a correct word. There is a diversification of approaches after 60s, which has continued till date. Right? Comparative literature, translation studies, world literature, all these are post-90s development in India. World literature, travel writing studies, and so on and so forth that you find today. So these are the diversified trends, and very often people combine multiple trends. Like Gayatri Chakravarti Spivak would define herself as Marxist, deconstructionist, feminist, right? So she is combining Marxism, feminism, and post-structuralism and post-colonialism as well, right? So people tend to combine multiple approaches today as well.
Right, so that is all for now.
I think there is a book by Peter Barry on literary criticism, and it has so it gives you an overview of called beginning theory. It gives you an overview of all literary theories and criticism, and also talks about something called post theory. Right? And most of the theories you will study in post graduation. जैसा structuralism क्या है, post structuralism क्या है, फिर post structuralist feminism, post structuralist psychoanalysis, post structuralist Marxism कैसे है, then post colonialism. ये सब 60 to 90 के बीच 30 साल में आए हुए ट्रेंड्स हैं. new historicism, cultural materialism, right? Their aftermath is what, so people like Spivak and Stephen Greenblatt, Terry Eagleton, आज भी जिंदा है वो लोग. They are aged, but these are the leading academic figures, very aged but leading figures. So they don't represent new generation, but that is a kind of things that have been left over. You also have gay, lesbian, and queer theory. So what do you have to say about this? And all these approaches define themselves against new criticism and Arnoldian culture study, right? Just like Sylvia Plath defines herself against Eliot, right? So Eliot is important, उसके खिलाफ जाकर आप लिखते हैं. Offending the order, which has, so this modernism which was revolutionary became orthodoxy, just like new romanticism which was revolutionary became orthodoxy, right?
Yes, sir.
Anyone else who has something to say about what conversation we had? Okay, so let's look at what is this new criticism, right? New criticism is a kind of label that is given to a group of scholars in American South, right? American South is, you are familiar with American South because of Harper Lee, right? That's the agriculture dominated, more conservative America. Southern part of America, not to be confused with South America, which is a different continent, right? So the southern part of America, or American South as it's known, is agriculture, and that's why many of the scholars associated with new criticism were the people who disliked industrialism and technological advances, right? And a group of scholars who were labeled as new critics were people like John Crow Ransom, Alan Tate, Wimsatt K. Wimsatt Jr., Monroe Beardsley, and Cleanth Brooks. And I think on page number 621 to 626, you have a reasonable amount of discussion on new criticism in Habib's book. So Habib does give substantial attention to new criticism, unlike he does to the Cambridge School. And the reason probably, and I may be wrong, is because Habib himself is American, right? So he's definitely interested in the developments in America. As so new criticism kind of spearheaded first by a person called John Crow Ransom and Alan Tate. Both of them were important poets of the period, right? In some way continuing Matthew Arnold and T.S. Eliot's legacy. They were poets of the period, and therefore their primary preoccupation seems to be with poetry. They drew upon the ideas of Cambridge scholars that we have mentioned, right? And all of them tried to emphasize disciplinary distinctiveness of literary criticism. That literary criticism is a kind of discipline in itself, right? And some of the most important books are the book called The New Criticism by John Crow Ransom, The World's Body, right? On page 622. And very interestingly, I think Wemsad and Beardsley, but he has not discussed Cleanth Brooks, a leading figure. One of the most important figures of new criticism is Cleanth Brooks, right? And his name of his books are like The Well-Wrought Urn. I don't know if the phrase reminds you of something. Well-wrought urn. Have you heard of this phrase? Anyone? किसी ने सुना है ये well-wrought urn? Canonization नाम की एक पोएम सुनी है आपने? जॉन डन.
Oh yes, yes sir.
उसमें आता है ना well-wrought urn. ऐसा phrase. Does anyone believe it? Okay, so well-wrought urn. So the lovers are also saints. They are beatified not by the church but by the poets. And poets commemorate the remains of the lovers in their poems. So poems are, according to John Donne, well-wrought urns. Right? Urn is where you preserve the remains or ashes of a saint or a dead person. So unlike the saints who are buried in half-acre tombs, right? ऐसा ही आता है ना? The lovers don't get that much space, and they are made saints by poets who commemorate them. They beautify them in their poems. So poems are the monuments and urns of lovers. That's the phrase. So what is Cleanth Brooks emphasizing is that all poems are well-wrought urns. It's what systematically, symmetrically crafted objects, right? And poetry or a poem is an object in itself, right? That is one of the core ideas of new criticism, that poem is nothing other than the poem, right? And this approach to literary criticism is discussed by M.H. Abrams in his critical orientation of, yes, we'll build in sonnets pretty rooms as well. A well-wrought urn becomes the greatest ashes as half-acre tombs, and by these means all shall approve us canonized for love, right? As Saloni has given us these lines. But let's go back to M.H. Abrams. We started out with M.H. Abrams, remember, 3 years ago. So let's go back to understand what new critics are saying. So I'm sharing my screen here. Can you see this screen?
Yes, sir.
Yes sir.
Right. So this is something that you will find in your glossary as well. So this is literary work, right? And it has got 3 coordinates. One is it's related to universe. The poem or the novel or a play is related to the universe. It is related to the artist and it's related to the audience. And these 4 relations are 4 major points of emphasis for various schools of criticism. So the school or a group of critics who emphasize relationship of a literary work with the universe, right, is called mimetic approach of literary criticism. It has this mimetic orientation. You see work as connected to the universe, right? That is one approach or orientation of critical theory. And an example of this would be Plato, of course, Aristotle, of course, neo-classical poets, of course, but also Marxists who are interested in relation of work and the world, right? The other area of emphasis is you focus on relation between artist and the work, right? And you see work as an expression of the artist, right? You see a poem or a novel as a product of artist's soul or mind or his plan, her plan. That is called the expressive orientation of critical theory. And the best example is the romantic theory of literature, but also psychoanalytical theory of literature, early psychoanalytical. Like Freud would argue that in some way Dostoevsky's novels reflect Dostoevsky's own unconscious problems, right? And his complex relation to his father, his own disturbed sexuality, and his habit of gambling. So Freud points out how novels are connected to Dostoevsky's novels are connected to artist's personality. So that is called expressive theory of literature, right? Another way of looking at literature is to focus on how work is connected to audience, right? And this would mean the impact of work on the audience, right? And the oldest idea goes to idea of catharsis in Aristotle, right? And where he says that it results in purgation of pity and fear, and it has a good positive impact on mind of the people, while Plato is arguing that it may have a bad impact on audience because you represent God in multiple ways. But apart from these old classical ideas, you can also look at impressionistic school of Walter Pater and Hazlitt as this orientation called pragmatic. And later in 20th century, you had reader response theory, reader response theories or approaches of literature, which emphasize relation between work and the audience, right? So these are the three theories: mimetic, expressive, and pragmatic. The fourth approach considers work of art as not really connected to universe, artist, or audience, right? It considers work of art as an object, a well-wrought urn, right? Or a verbal icon. That is another title of a book by Clint Brooks. It sees literature as a thing, an object, which is not connected directly to artist, audience, or universe, but a thing in itself, not to be confused with Kant's idea of thing in itself, right? But independent of universe, artist, and audience. And that is one of the cornerstones of what M.H. Abrams calls objective theories of literature, which treat work as an objective fact, right? And new criticism is one of the best examples of objective theory of criticism. Is that clear? Any questions about what is new criticism's core idea? Do you have to say anything about this? So as we draw close slowly to our syllabus in the 6th semester, we are returning to M.H. Abrams, right? Where we started out from 3 years ago. So objectivist criticism or objective orientation of new criticism. And when you say orientation, it does not mean that you don't look at other aspects. but your primary interest and focus is on that link. So primary focus is on universe and literary work, then your orientation is of mimetic kind. If you're interested in reading Kubla Khan as an expression of Coleridge's addiction, then that is expressive orientation of criticism. But if you are interested in what is the impact that particular novel has on you, then you are looking at the pragmatic orientation of criticism. So when you go to watch a film and you say that I feel like weeping, and that's why मुझे बहुत दुख हुआ ये पिक्चर देख के, इसीलिए पिक्चर बहुत अच्छी है, और it makes me feel sad. That's why this film is good. So that kind of critical statements are called pragmatic statements, right? While the fourth one is interested in poem as a poem, on words on the page, right? A text as an objective artifact, a thing, and criticism as a scientific analysis of that thing called a literary text. And very interestingly, John Crowe Ransom uses the term ontology of a poem. That means what that poem really is, right? Is the primary focus of the critic. And he insists upon making criticism a scientific activity rather than an impressionistic activity. Right? And he says that literary criticism should not focus on biography or personal effects, or also try to provide a paraphrase or synopsis of a poem, because by definition poem is not paraphrasable. And Client Brooks uses a phrase called heresy of paraphrase. Means you are saying something in the poem in a prose form, right? So if poet could express or could say the same thing in prose, why would she or he write poetry? So by definition, poetry is something that cannot be paraphrased, right? Heresy of paraphrase. That is also one of the ideas of new criticism. कुछ पूछना है? We'll discuss the other key ideas tomorrow. Anything that you have to say about these ideas, whatever we have discussed till now? Doubts? सो गए या अभी जाग रहे हैं आप लोग? कुछ कहना नहीं है? Yes, one which focuses on relation between work and audience, Chayan, is called pragmatic orientation of critical theories, and the examples can go back to Aristotle and Plato, but also to impressionistic criticism of Walter Pater and Hazlitt, but it can also apply to modern reader response theories of criticism, which you will study in your post-graduation. Yes. Yeah. But if you want curious to know in a nutshell what is reader's response criticism, what is cognitive literary studies, what is literary Darwinism, what is eco-criticism, तो एक जगह पे आपको सब मिल जाएगा और वो है ग्लॉसरी ऑफ लिटरेरी टर्म्स जो आपने फर्स्ट साल में खरीदी थी. So जल्दी, if you are interested in reading all these, then you will find all these things in your glossary. Post-structuralism, structuralism, literary Darwinism, gay, queer theory, gender criticism, feminism, सब कुछ ग्लॉसरी में आपको मिलेगा. न्यू क्रिटिसिज्म के ऊपर भी अच्छी एंट्री है ग्लॉसरी में और न्यू हिस्टोरिसिज्म पे अच्छी एंट्री है. मॉडर्निज्म, पोस्ट मॉडर्निज्म पे एंट्री है. So if jaldi you are curious to know about the later developments, then glossary is best place to read. और जो अभी हमने डिस्कशन किया ओरिएंटेशन का, वो क्रिटिसिज्म की एंट्री में आएगा, तो देख लेना. सो कितने लोगों ने ग्लॉसरी अभी तक बचा के रखी है? एक. तन्वी, अमेरा, यस, गुड. मानसी, बाकी सब लोगों ने क्या किया ग्लॉसरी का? रद्दी में तो नहीं भेज दी? तो ठीक है, ये तो भेज दोगे तो चने भी नहीं आएंगे आपके लिए. And if you have lost it, not bought it, then buy it now. Right? It cost hardly 250 rupees online. Amazon वाला घर पे दे के आएगा. 11th edition लेना नया. M.H. Abrams and Halpern, right? Jeffrey Halpern. 11th edition. That's one of the best introductions to all these things. उसमें neoclassical और romantic का भी बहुत अच्छा है. There is entry on objective, correlative, dissociation of sensibility, and so on and so forth. New criticism, art for art's sake, aestheticism, symbolism, expressionism, imagism, surrealism, Dadaism, everything. Realism and naturalism पे बहुत अच्छी entry है. So study smart. So if you have lost that book, then you can buy it online. Because for all your entrance tests, your NET and SLET and PET and GATE, and you will find the glossary as invaluable. Right? I cleared my NET using that glossary in 1995, before you were born. Okay, so let us meet tomorrow.